Everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. For today's how-to webinar, we'll take a look at how to improve your forecast using the Arkieva Statistical Forecasting Solution. My name is Helen Atiaboa. I'm the Marketing Manager at Arkieva, and I'll be moderating this webinar. And today I'm excited to have with me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Isaguirre. I'm Project Manager in Arkieva.
So Jennifer is one of our senior consultants, and we're very excited to have her with us today. Before I get started, as usual, I'd like to mention that if you have trouble hearing us at any time, please let us know using the chat feature in GoToWebinar, and we'll be sure to assist you. Also, we'll reserve a few minutes at the end of the webinar for questions as we go through the presentation. If you think of the questions, you can feel free to just enter them as you think of them. And we have a survey that helps us improve our webinars. It's going to come up at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to fill that in as well. So today's topic is how to improve your forecasting using the Arkieva forecasting solution. And as usual, since we have some new folks with us today, it's essential that we just show you a little overview of the Arkieva solution. So the Arkieva solution is a full suite. It has it's a full planning platform that helps you create a harmonized S&OP process by providing a centralized repository for proactive demand planning, optimize inventory management, continuous capacity planning, demand and supply synergy, which enhances your overall visibility using reports and dashboards. Today's how-to presentation will focus on how we can help you with becoming more proactive with responding to demand by improving your forecasting process. And for today's presentation, we're going to be showing the forecasting solution, but this is part of the full demand package that we offer at Arkieva. And we all understand that generating an accurate forecast for every combination of product, market, and region is both an art and a science. So as a result of that, the Arkieva Demand Planner comes with features for demand forecasting, analysis, sensing, shaping, and collaboration. And for today, we're going to be focusing on the forecasting engine, which generates the baseline forecast so that you can start to collaborate as a team. And it helps you essentially determine the best fit forecasting method and plan. This is a highly in-depth feature with over 25 different forecasting methods. So we're going to touch upon it a little bit, but just since we only have about an hour, we may not be able to go into everything. So let's look at today's webinar agenda. So a few topics that we hope to be able to discuss today. We're going to look at aggregation and accuracy. We're also going to look at what level of detail you should be forecasting. We'll look at how frequent you should forecast and how you go about selecting the proper level of aggregation. And then to tie it all together, we're going to look at some statistical forecasting techniques. And we'll get to the fun part where we show you the Arkieva forecasting solution. So now to pass it over to Jennifer, we're going to start the discussion with a broad-based question of what is forecasting.
Okay, thanks, Helen. Okay, so as Helen was mentioning in the agenda, my idea is to go over a few of the basics on a statistical forecast, especially questions and key questions that we ask ourselves before preparing essentially our strategy to manage a statistical forecast, and in this case, of course, focus on the solution in Arkieva. So forecasting, as mentioned as well before, itself is considered an art and a science, and at a basic level is essentially predicting what will happen in the future. In this case, because we're talking about demand, then we'll just call it demand forecasting. For that and for any business, again, in essence, is estimating the quantity for each product, your customers, maybe at different locations, that will have demand in a relevant future. Okay? So forecasting itself is not the actual shipments that you're going to send, not what you can supply or your internal consumptions within your different locations. It is simply what will be demanded from your customers in the future. Okay. Having that as a basic, then we ask, why do we need forecasts? And in this case, demand forecasting. So businesses and companies need forecasting for different reasons, but overall, most of the industries rely on a statistical forecast to take into consideration product life cycles, business cycles, which are essentially patterns that we see in sales history. Also, in order to take into account lead times that require us to react. So essentially in supply chain, if we have lead times that are greater than our customers' lead time in order to get goods, then that is key to capture and considering in a statistical forecast analysis. It also helps, depending on the time horizon, to provide input for long-term decisions. As an example, capital investments. So we'll talk about horizons and how those are defined. And other reasons are to manage peak demand and also be able to compare it against an average capacity production, to manage the spare parts, to manage transport cost, manufacturing cost. So essentially give that baseline for what you will be demanded in the future and be able to address all these different topics. Then why do we need to do it regularly? We start with that question, and then again, depending on what we are analyzing, we define how frequently. So that's one of the things we'll talk after this. But one of a few reasons of why we need to do this with certain frequency would be because we need to react as companies to rapid changes in our markets. Okay? So again, depending on the markets in which we're at, then of course changes will vary. But we need to be able to be prepared for that. Also, when we have long-range forecasts, they can be inaccurate. Therefore, in order to provide a good result and good numbers that help with production planning and scheduling, we need to keep monitoring this forecast closely. Therefore, that frequency will help us be, again, more prepared for those shorter-term needs and challenges in some cases. And also one of the key factors is that demand drives a supply plan. Therefore, and one of the main reasons for this topic, that's why having an accurate, not only regularly looking at it and calculating it, but also having or achieving or trying to achieve a more accurate demand will help us have a better input for our supply plan. So knowing that this is a starting point, then of course a supply plan will be the one that will give us production decisions, will allow us to do any needs of pre-ordering components and be able to allocate resources, and of course also transportation and logistics decisions, but also costs. Okay, then we run into accuracy. So why then, on top of all of this, we need to be accurate with our forecast, or as accurate as we can. High level basics are because of the impact of inventory. As we know, if we are now saying that forecasting will give us our starting point for demand for what our customers are going to ask from us, and then that will be our baseline for supply planning, then of course any deviations or any inaccuracy on a forecast will have an impact on inventory, whether it's having excess on stocks or of course falling short. So having a more accurate forecast will allow us to have less stockouts would also allow us to have a higher perfect order fulfillment, and in addition to that, could help us increase our profit margin. Okay. So keeping that in mind, that we're gonna then focus on accuracy, and that it's one of the key reasons for spending time in a statistical forecast and then overall in a good demand planning process. Then one of the basic questions that we are gonna be addressing is, at what level should we forecast? Then I'll start with this chart, and so I'll just load everything because I want to discuss it with a little more detail. So what I'm trying to highlight here is, when we talk about level, is level at which we essentially sell, or how we have our sales orders. Of course, it's basic. We have our products and our customers, but we can have, again, other levels at which we record these sales records. In this case, maybe it could be sales organization, sales area. So knowing that we have a low level of detail for our sales history, which will be a starting point for forecast, we need to understand that that's not enough. We can't just do a statistical forecast at that level at which we have our sales record. We need to aggregate our data, our sales history data, in order to achieve a more accurate statistical forecast. So while having a calculation and a result from a statistical forecast at a detailed level is useful, because that is how we're going to see the detail on how much a customer is going to ask for each material, for example, it's not really going to be that accurate. It actually causes or adds a lot of noise to the forecast that you do want to get in terms of accuracy. Therefore, it's important to start thinking about aggregating this data and have different levels at which statistical forecasts will be calculated in order to achieve a more accurate result. Okay, then let's now dive into that, into low and high levels of forecasts. That also doesn't mean that you only have two levels of forecast. We usually have, especially in Arkieva, which is the things that I'm going to add in the demonstration, we have the lowest level of detail, which we always need to have and start with, but we also have intermediate levels at which we do this calculations. So in this case, if we have intermediates and high, things that are key to consider is that we usually include a combination of methods for doing this analysis. As we were mentioning earlier, Arkieva provides over 25 statistical methods, so these are just standard mathematical methods, and our best practice is not to just blindly use all of the methods that are available, but be able to also select the methods that are matching with the data that you're using, the level at which you're looking at the data. So we'll talk about that in the demo, but it's key to highlight that at least for the intermediate and high level levels of aggregation, we usually have a combination of methods as average, cyclical, and trends. Okay? Another thing that comes up a lot when we talk about aggregation of data is, how do we aggregate it, right? So to start a discussion, one of the things that I want to highlight, that as a starting point, a rule of thumb is, if we aggregate to a higher level of data and the amount of records reduces in between 50 to 90%, then you're doing a good aggregation. You want to make sure that you keep that in mind as you monitor the amount of data that you're using for your levels. Okay. And one other remark is that, and I think it's a key remark in terms of accuracy and how you within your industry measure accuracy, is that typically one of these medium or intermediate levels at which you do the analysis and run a statistical forecast calculation matches with the way that you measure forecasts. Okay. So that's good to keep in mind when deciding how to make these levels within Arkieva especially. Okay. Okay. So a few more things considering that should be considered as well as the levels that I just mentioned is then frequency and also time horizon. So I was answering the question before on why do we need to do this on a regular basis, but now as well then how regular, how often do I need to look into my statistical forecast? As a good practice is, and typically it's done on a monthly level or a monthly frequency. So at a minimum, once a month, you want to ensure that you run a statistical forecast calculations, especially because you want to then consider the latest sales history that you have. So you want to ensure that calculation sees that you have already sold X amount of products for your customer, knowing that, again, the baseline will be your history. Okay. Of course, we've seen in some industries or some business, even weekly, is needed, especially if you're starting to set these levels and what we will review in Arkieva, set your strategies. Certainly, as a starting point, you want to have a more frequent monitoring or do more frequent calculations of a statistical forecast, especially if you're making changes to the strategy. But once that is set, it's usually a process that is done once a month. Okay. Then we talk about time horizon. Knowing that we were mentioning that a statistical forecast gives us what is going to be demanded from our customers on a future. I mentioned earlier that I put the word relevant future because it will depend on the industry in which you're at. In some cases, you only want to focus on a more shorter term to provide just enough for your production planning and scheduling. But in other cases, like also I was highlighting, you're actually doing a long-term planning. So that, depending on that need, then you want to decide and especially set how far ahead you're going to do this calculation and give you a result. Okay. So those questions that I have here in the slide are the ones that you want to ask yourself. So what actually determines this horizon? Why do I need this forecast? And also in which circumstances or what are the circumstances that you want to consider to determine this time horizon? So at least from our experience, we've seen that at a minimum, we do want to see a result from a statistical forecast at least for 6 up to 12 months in the future. A rolling horizon, essentially what it means is that as we move forward in time, I want to ensure that I always see the next 6 to 12 months. So I'll describe it as well in Arkieva, but overall, in any solution, especially in demand planning solutions within Arkieva, we ensure that we move together with time. So every month, we want to ensure that we see, for example, once we start July next month, that we see the next 6 to 12 months in the future and always have that as an automated process. Then, of course, as I was mentioning, another key point to consider is what you need in terms of capacity and resource planning. Again, always keeping in mind that if this is going to be my starting point for a supply plan, then I want to ensure that I consider my times and lead times within my whole supply planning as part of this analysis on time horizon. Okay. Then now that we have all this information and what level or aggregation level means, how or what can we do in Arkieva, then we start then thinking, and hopefully you are already thinking, then how can I select this right level of aggregation, or what is a right level of aggregation as well? So I have a few examples at a very basic level. For example, if you the products that you sell are specific to your customers, then for sure you want to ensure that you cover levels of a statistical forecast calculation at the product and customer level. So by customer, you want to see how much you're gonna how much is going to be demanded for each product, knowing that all of them are specific for each customer. In other cases, depending on your industry, you might have products that are perishable, maybe poisonous, so you need to consider it's a different way of looking at them. In that case, you actually care about the location, right? You care about especially where you have them and from where are gonna be later produced or shipped. So in that case, location might be certainly relevant. Okay. Other examples, if, for example, the logistics costs is outweighed by the manufacturing cost, then you want to focus on a product level. So in this case, you don't care so much about the detail on the customers, but you're actually looking at your numbers mainly by product and considering at again, in this case, on an aggregated level of calculation. Then other examples, if you're assembled to order or practice postponement, then you also do it, but in this case by bulk or stored product level. So these are just examples, but again, it always depends on the industry, but for sure, everyone will have at least at a minimum products or materials and customers. And then it depends on how much we can aggregate it from there. Okay, so we said that within Arkieva we have at least 25 statistical methods or approximately 25 statistical methods. These are mathematical methods, so if anyone is interested in the details, so I know that we have white papers and these are just industry and, like I said, just basic statistical methods. However, one of the good functionalities and feature in Arkieva that I will show you is that the Arkieva engine that runs the statistical forecast calculations will make use or can make use of a group of these methods and pick the best. That way, as a user, as a planner, I don't really have the need to run one by one or do any analysis on the side. This is the benefit of this solution, that you actually can group and just let the engine decide which one is the best. So what I'm showing here is how usually the methods are grouped, and certainly how we in Arkieva, which you'll see later, is how we by default have some standard ways of grouping them. But just to give you some examples, if you have, let's say, the methods that are more related to an average type of of sales history, then the methods that we usually use and group are moving average, exponential smoothing, weighted average. Here you see, of course, some pros and cons. For example, for the average, we know that, sure, it can be fairly accurate or it would be helpful at a shorter term, and it's a safe default, especially if we know that there's no trend, or maybe it's a recent product, more like an active new type of product. Then this is a good set of methods that are used and that will be selected. But if we are thinking a more, of course, a longer term, and certainly if you know that you have seasonality or that you have patterns, then you want to then use other types of methods. So others that I want to highlight are those seasonal. So for example, if you know that you have trends, which is the next section, we use, or you find that our methods available, which are fairly common, like double exponential smoothing, double weights. We also have options to use linear regression. So in this case, one of the key remarks and the pros of the using the set of methods is that the recent history, it's monitored closely and it's used, it has a higher weight. So in this case, it's used to determine, again, the best method, and it allows you to pick up the trends that you have in history. Of course, one of the cons because of that, because of how it focuses on finding these trends, then it can be misleading if you have noise in your data. So I'll briefly talk about how also in Arkieva, even when I won't spend too much time today on that, in Arkieva you obviously have an option to do adjustments to your history, especially if you want to remove outliers. Certainly it's key if you have a lot of trends or patterns in the way that you sell products. So at a high level, just so you can take a look, you see that we have methods like seasonal method itself, multiple regression are also things that we can configure within Arkieva, especially if you have external factors that have an impact on that could have an impact on your demand forecast. Okay. Okay, so that is essentially what I wanted to cover in terms of basic content, because the majority, of course, will be done in Arkieva. That's what I want to do now and switch. So I'll come on from here. So I already have my Arkieva session open. As well, knowing that some of you that are joining today, this is probably the first one that you've seen Arkieva, so I'll quickly walk you through the basics of what you see in the screen. By default, especially in this session that I'm using, one of the things that we are able to publish within Arkieva is show you a process, especially if it's unique to your industry, a high-level process that it's followed, in this case, for demand planning, and that within the tool allows you to quickly go into the different documents or components that we have in Arkieva. Other basics is that is the main section that we see here is my area of work. And on the left, all the different, again, components and documents that we have by default and configure are available depending on the planning module that we're looking at. In this case, we're mainly focusing on demand management or demand planning. Okay. At the top, you'll notice as I also show you the different documents that are covered with the webinar today, that in the top section we have different ribbons, which are the menus that give us different options and features within that specific module. Okay. So before actually opening the statistical forecast module, I want to highlight the other key factors that are part of demand planning process that in Arkieva, of course, you have a solution to handle them, but essentially are key as part of a process within any industry. One of them is, I'll highlight it here, but then of course I'll quickly show you some of those documents. But essentially one of the things that I mentioned and that are key to consider is, for example, the product life cycle. So we want to be able to, and that's highly useful for statistical forecast and the way that you're going to split your data and segment your levels. It allows you to have understanding on whether or not you have a product that is becoming inactive, or if you have a product that maybe is actually fairly new or active new. And that certainly allows you or gives you some insight or ideas on what are the best methods that I should be able to use in order to have a statistical forecast that will be more accurate. Okay. So in that case, I will actually quickly open just so you can have an idea of what I'm talking about. So essentially, one of the things that we are able to do within Arkieva and why I'm mentioning is we have a tool that allows you to do segmentation of data. So while I'm not going to dive into it today, I want to make sure that you are all aware of it because I might mention some of these things within a statistical forecast component. And in this case, what I'm just showing you at a glance is that you're able to, within Arkieva, have, again, this analysis on your data and also be able to classify it. So as you know, you might have already in your industry an ABC classification of your materials or your customers. So that already gives you a good insight on how do you want to then do analysis on a statistical forecast, which will be different between these groups of products. So this already is certainly a good starting point. In some cases, of course, just the simple knowledge of your products helps, and you can then, in the statistical forecast solution, split the data accordingly. But for us in Arkieva, this is also one of the tools that we highly use as a first step. Okay. Okay, so I'll close it and then go back to my workflow and just as we're going to open the statistical forecast solution. Okay. So again, let me just walk you through some of the basics Um, in my statistical forecast solution or component, you see that I have a new menu that will give me a few options to manage an asset planner to control my statistical forecast levels and calculations. So this is where we start pretty much answering that question or start putting together the pieces that I was describing with the slides. So the question was, well, what are the levels that I need to use and how do I start putting them together pretty much. So I already, of course, put a few to demonstrate it, but I'll start, if you see what I'm doing here with this drop-down section is essentially show you how we can start configuring the levels and have an option to go back and forth to review the results at a lower level or a higher level, and then based on that, prepare what will end up being our statistical forecast strategy. So as you might recall, I was mentioning in one of my slides that the first thing that we need to do is, of course, to start with our detail level. So just to put that with data, then I'll show you that in this case, my lowest level of detail is essentially product, location, and customer. So my records of orders are essentially, in this case, I actually use the word stored. The data is kept by product, location, and shipped to. It might be that it's because it's fairly unique, my product and customer, but that is the lowest level of detail. So I want to certainly start here and configure my first level. So that's why I also name it 1. So as a planner, it gives me a good indicator on where do I start. I was highlighting that while this is great and useful because especially as a planner, and if you share this information with your sales team, then it will, most of them, it will be fairly clear because they know their customers and the products, and that is really useful. But as I was highlighting, that doesn't mean that it's accurate. So we actually configure a few more, and this is where this aggregation piece comes into play. So now that I know that this is my lowest level, I'll just click on one extra. I am now going to aggregate it one step up, and pretty much, if you see, get rid of customer and have it not by each of the materials or SKUs, but actually have it by a product family. So if I have this information, I can aggregate it a little bit higher and notice that the amount of, in this case, combination of product family and location is much less than the detailed ones. So this is where that 50 to 90% analysis or rule of thumb is useful. So see that by default, it gives me all those combinations. I'm going to click on one of them just to show you this is where you start spending time and doing as a planner and just confirming what we're doing matches with what you need for your industry. So what I did before the session, I actually already generated a statistical forecast. As a planner, the way that you can do that in Arkieva is, I'll show you, fairly simple because it's simply by pushing a button, you can run the engine that generates this or does the calculation and generates the method that you need. Usually within our implementations, this is something that we can configure to do it automatically. So it's not necessarily or mandatory that you have to do it by coming here and pushing it. But as you put your levels together and figure out the best strategy, then for sure you will do it here. Okay? The other piece then that you might be asking is then, well, where do I select my methods or what? I know that I see that I have a bunch of results, but where do I select that? For that, in this analysis section, we have a drop-down that gives you, as a starting point, gives you the list of all these 25 plus methods that we have in Arkieva. So I'll just scroll a little bit up and down. You see that you have your average, pretty much the ones that I was showing you in the slides. But on top of that, by default, we have already configured a group of these methods. So it ties back to that last slide where I was showing that while you have 25 and plus, first of all, you don't want to run them all together. You want to group them depending on the level at which you're doing the analysis and also depending on your industry and the knowledge that you have on this product. So That's why in the previous step of demand planning, if you already know that you have high variability, then you want to be able to select methods that tie or pick up that variability, or well, in this case, sorry, if you have lower variability, then you want to and figure out which in that particular section, which are the methods that are key, because some of them are seasonal. So you want to focus on that. And for some others, seasonal, it's not really going to help you so much, and average is sufficient. So you want to do that. So in that case, we group those methods in order to help with the type of data that you have. So in this case, because you saw that I was selecting an intermediate or high level of aggregation of my data, I already have a group that is called Arkieva high level. What I can see, once I selected that and I generated my forecast, then this populates and gives me my best method. This runs fairly fast, and I can actually demonstrate because it doesn't take much. So, well, it already gives me the same result, but in a few seconds, it gives you already the best method. So that's why this particular column is populated. So just to walk you through what you see, whenever you select then one of the combinations, now the analysis that we do as a planner is then essentially check what is the result that the engine gave me. So one of the quick ways to do that is, while as a planner I don't need to have the details on this specific method, I want to understand this section on the right. My section on the right indicates that it went through essentially my Arkieva high level, right, the one that I selected here, went through a series of methods that I put them all together and essentially told the engine, go through all of these and pretty much figure out which is the best method because it has the least amount of error. So that's why this section is called error. And you can see that by hovering over each of the methods that were used, you can see, at least in this section at a high level, what was the error, and have a little bit of understanding why that one was selected. So another thing that helps, especially if you're very visual, you can click on each of the bars for the method that was selected and also see if it actually picked up the pattern that you were expecting to pick. If we're looking at data that can have some trends, then I want to notice not only how it picked it up or how it matches your history, but also what it did with that in the future. Okay? Why this is also then an extra step for checking the best method that was used is because in some cases, when you do have high variability and where we know that a statistical forecast, it won't really be accurate. It will be very challenging for a statistical forecast method to be able to be accurate with products and customers that you have high variability. So in those cases, while you want to still run them, and especially as a starting point, while you still want to run them through the engine, then in some cases you actually want to overwrite it. So this is where we start talking about the inputs of and knowledge that the planner has or knowledge that you have from the markets. And in this case, by just looking at the graph, you can then identify if, for example, I click on this, maybe it's a clear color, it's noticing a trend, so it's noticing this particular pattern, but as a planner, I know that that is not really the one that it's going to make more sense to my business. If I select one probably a little bit lower and I actually agree with this type of result, even when the engine told me that another one has the least amount of error, I can override it. So that means that I can come in here and essentially tell the system to skip this one in terms of analysis for the best method and always default to the one that I like, the one that I know will actually fit best. So I can come here and select Fourier, and that essentially the next time that we run is going to be fixed. So these are a few things that you can do as a planner, at least at this level. Just to highlight the next step, of course, within the model, you might notice that there's more information. So certainly in terms of a statistical forecast, there's a lot of information that especially here available that you wanna, if you wanna dive into the results that the solution provided, you can always do that and do it by each of the combinations that you select. You can see that here at the bottom section we start with a chart, but you can always look at the specifics of the results by the methods that were used, and of course in the section of the data you can also see the actual data that was used for the analysis. Because in this case, knowing that a statistical forecast is an art and science to predict the future, it relies on your history. So in this case, you can see what is that history that was used and picked up, and especially if you have previously done any updates to your sales history, then you want to ensure that the right numbers for your sales orders were picked up. So you can always do this type of analysis within the same statistical forecast component. In the case where we do end up using regression, there's also a section for that. And here, I'll go back to my chart. In the error section, this gives you a high level, but also here you are able to add more methods just to have a quick glance and, well, I know that in my combination I use all the ones that have a log, but I also want to add others and quickly see how that would look like. So those that you can add here, of course, clearly they were not part of the best method process, but they can give you a especially graphical view on how it would look like if you do run the analysis by that method. Okay. Okay. Then for a statistical forecast method, like I mentioned, it's not as mandatory that we dive into that, especially as a planner. But if you do, you see that on the top section in the ribbon, there's a method editor, because you might have the question on, well, I have this Arkieva high level, which is the one that I used in my views, but in some cases, you actually want to create your own combination of methods. So I want to actually create my favorite ones because I already did my analysis on history. I already know that I want to run this view for a section of my data. Then I can go into this editor and create a new group or custom methods. It's still, of course, using the available standard mathematical methods, but you can then group it differently from the defaults that Arkieva provides. So certainly as an advanced demand planner, this is an area where you might want to spend time on once you already have your data segmented and once you are able to identify the levels at which you want to aggregate data. Here as well, you enhance even further how you want to group the methods depending on your industry. Okay. Then lastly, at least within this section, is what what we call the strategy. So now we said, I'll show you this section. We said that we have, at least for my data, these are all testing, but I have 1, 2, 3, 4 levels. We call them here forecast views because I'm, of course, reviewing the statistical forecast results. And what we do with these different levels of aggregation is group them in order to form a strategy. What that means is that I want to then ensure that the engine runs calculations at each of these levels in order to achieve or try to achieve a more accurate result. And what the engine does then is run a statistical forecast at a detail level in order to be able to pick up the patterns at that level and know exactly what each product and customer is doing in terms of your sales history and project. And then once we do that, run the calculations at a higher level, at the intermediate and then at the high. And the reason for that is because, again, I'm trying to achieve a more accurate result, but still what Arkieva and the engine will do, it will then desegregate down the results. So, for example, if I'm right now running calculations for this location, its product family, if I look at this result and this looks good in terms of accuracy, once I save my results, then I don't have to worry about how much it's going to fall for each of the products of this family. What Arkieva is able to do is disaggregate down thanks to the analysis that was done at the detail level. So because I know that you have X amount of materials and customers for AA and in Atlanta, then I am able to take this result and disaggregate down. So that's why it's key that you always start with a detail and then simply start aggregating to get your accuracy. So once you have all this, in my case, 4 different levels, I want to form a strategy. So within the same module, you have this last button called Strategy Manager. I created one for you. I'm going to just double click. And what that does is, what I'm doing is pretty much telling my system that this is the strategy that I want to run. I want to ensure that every time that as Arkieva, we run automatically these calculations, because as mentioned, as a demand planner, you don't have to come in here and run each of these levels manually. What you can do is set up a strategy and essentially leave it up to an automatic process to go through each level one by one and do the disaggregation in order to get your more accurate result. Okay, so at least in terms of a statistical forecast, that's one of the key things that I want to highlight within this particular component. Just in terms of adding to this in comments is that a statistical forecast, again, as we have been mentioning, is a baseline. In some cases, certainly that's not where you want to stop, especially where you have high variability. You rely on collaboration. So I think, as Helen was highlighting at the beginning, something as well that is included in our solution for demand planning, you have then an extra step of collaboration. You want to ensure that you do have information from your markets and the knowledge that you have from your sales team in order to actually get to an even more accurate result, because a statistical forecast can do so much. And again, more focus in the cases where you have high variability. So once you are able to have a baseline, and I'll just at least show you in the workflow, you want to ensure that you have a collaboration piece in order to provide that input and then just pretty much improve even more the baseline that we generated with statistical forecast. Okay, then at least that's what I wanted to show, or what we are able to show today for within Arkieva. I'll just go back to the slides because we want to make sure that that we have a good summary of what we just reviewed and see how we are.
All right, thank you so much, Jennifer. I think that was very insightful. So let's go through some key takeaways, things that I noted down. Basically, we want to know when and why to forecast. And then we also discussed what the aggregate levels should be. That's very important as you try to make your forecast more accurate. And then how frequent should you forecast? Should it be monthly? Should it be weekly? That's something that Jen covered as well. And as usual, it's going to be dependent on your specific situation. And then the statistical techniques to consider. Our solution comes fully equipped with different solutions that you can consider. But as Jen showed, each scenario is different, so you can go in, reconfigure based on the specific scenarios. So we showed this. It was a very high-level demo, but as usual, you can always contact us and get a very specific, tailored demo using your own data. Even if you're already an Arkieva client using the solution, if there's something specific that you feel like, yeah, you know what, I could spend a little bit more time kind of figuring that out, we'll be happy to spend some time as well. So you can simply email me or go to our website and use the demo button. As usual, this is part of our webinar series. This is our how-to webinar series that we just started this year, really going through the tool, trying to help you take full advantage of all the capabilities within the Arkieva solution. Our next webinar is going to focus on dashboard KPIs. So the topic is how to select effective dashboard KPIs, and that's going to be covered by one of our dashboard experts in-house. We also will have this webinar up on our website within a few days, and if you register for the webinar, you will certainly receive the recording so that you can review it at any time that you would like to. So now we're going to open up the discussion for questions. So at this time, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them using the questions window in GoToWebinar. Now then, while we wait for folks here to enter their questions, I had a question about the strategy section. So once you go ahead and create a strategy, what would be the next step to check if the strategy is actually good and it's working for your business?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question, and certainly you want to consider that once you have your strategy set. One of the things that certainly you can do within Arkieva, we have another solution called Forecast Improvement Module. What that helps you do is pretty much what we call it is essentially provide a sandbox for testing out your strategies. So without committing yet to the strategy and committing to the end results that are going to call statistical forecasts, this sandbox allows you to do this trial and error, and essentially test and compare the results from different strategies in order to decide which one is the best one. So certainly just going into that module will be another solution that will add value to your demand planning process.
Okay, great. So we also have a question that came in that's from Killian. Killian wants to know what would be the best measure to track accuracy? Is it MAPE or, and then what's a good percentage for MAPE?
Good question. So I will actually show that real quick in Arkieva because that's part of what you can and certainly use as a planner because it's good to know what is available, at least within Arkieva. So let me just go here. At least what, oh, sorry about that. I'll go back here. Okay, so that is something that you can decide or control within the method editor. Our best practice has been, let me just go back to the one that I was using. We have different options, but we have gone through using MAD to also using MAPE. So those are more the typical ones that we used. And in this case, as I'm showing you right now, and why it's good that you can set your favorite methods, you can always, again, run both and see if there's a different outcome because you're measuring your error through MAPE instead of MAD. So it depends certainly on the industry and on your business, but this is the ones that we use as a default.
Okay, great. So another question that we also have some time for is, should we always use the same horizon for forecast calculations for all levels?
That is good. So in this case, it's not mandatory. So that's a good thing to highlight. I know that I was mentioning that as a default you have 6 to 12 or as a minimum because that's what we recommend. But in some cases, there are two things that I can say to answer the question. So one is actually how much history you want to consider. In this case, we usually request or ask as a best practice to have a minimum of 12 months of history up to, we can go 3 years back in history, because we want to ensure that we pick up any seasonality or patterns that can be longer than just a few months. So that's at least in history. And how far in future? That just simply goes back to the comment that I was making on what type of product and industry you're working with. In some cases, sure, 6 and 12 months is enough, but in others, you want to actually go to 18 or 24 because you're talking about a longer time horizon.
Okay, great. We also have another question from Amber. Amber wants to know, when forecasting for spot business or seasonal business, how often should we update our statistical forecasting?
In this case, I certainly will go back to recommending having that minimum of a monthly check. As I was highlighting, this does not mean that you as a planner need to go here and run it every month. That's something that we can do automatically for you. But you do want to make sure that once we start a new month, because we should be already receiving and loading your history from the previous month, that has a high weight in our analysis. So we want to make sure that if that data point and time series is key for what we are projecting, that you want to make sure that you review that at least once a month. So certainly in that case, I still prefer that option. But of course, in some cases, you might want to go once at least a quarter. But I always prefer that you have a review at least once a month.
Okay, great. So it looks like we don't have any more questions. And as usual, this does not have to be the end of this discussion, so you can feel free to email us, fill out a form, or reach out directly to your Arkieva representative if you have additional questions. Thank you very much for spending time with us today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.